folks, Ariel over here at Nyth, where today I wanted to do a video just answering some questions about canning. I've done, if you've been here for any little bit of time watching videos, you've probably seen I've done various videos over the years of things that I have canned, and I've got a lot of different questions on all of those about different aspects of that. So I thought I would do, and I've answered some of those questions in various videos, but it's kind of scattered here and there. So I thought today I would do one just trying to answer all the questions I can think of in a single video, kind of for reference. So I kind of collected questions from either things people have commented and asked me on various videos, and on the community tab on YouTube and over on my MeWe page, I asked people what questions they have. And so I actually have a list here that I wrote down, so hopefully I won't forget anything that people ask, and we're going to try to cover that. First, what you're looking at here is various things that I personally have canned in my pantry right at the moment. This is service berry juice. It would be actually tastes much like a grape juice. Service berries are a wild berry that grows here. This is spaghetti sauce. This is peaches. This is Danish Christmas cabbage. This is dill pickles. This is one of my many colors of pickled carrots. This is pickled beets, sweet pickles, and applesauce. Now the first thing I want to talk about is I guess the very first thing I want to mention is somebody asked, why is it called canning, not jarring? In some areas I think it's called preserving. Across most of the states it is called canning, I think because preserving food in a sealed container started out being in a can, and then there was some home canning methods for that, but most of it went to being done in glass jars, which is the only kind I have ever personally done or know of anybody doing at home to this day. So you call it canning, jarring, preserving, whatever you want. In the States it's often called canning, even though this is a glass jar, not a metal can. Second, there are several major ways to preserve food. So you can eat food fresh, like a cherry is growing on a tree, you pick the cherry and you eat it. That's delicious, that's awesome, that is probably the best possible way to get your food. But if you, for instance, like cherries, cherries only grow on a tree for maybe 3-4 weeks out of the year. Any particular place, if you're getting them from multiple places, maybe you can get 6 to 8 weeks if you're getting them from different locations. But then for the other 10 to 11 months of the year, there will be no cherries. And the same is kind of true for the vast majority of foods. There are some things that are easy, depending on your climate, to produce year-round fresh, like lettuce or microgreens. If you're not too hot and you're not too cold, it's too cold outside for me right now. Or you can do things like sprouting. Like, I have a whole video on this if you're interested. Just Google Nyth sprouting. I'm always growing fresh little green sprouts. Just had some for my lunch. Have some more here. Those kind of things are very easy to produce fresh consistently. So I never preserve my sprouts in any way because I'm always able to grow. In a few days I can grow more of them. But if you grow any kind of food, or if somebody else does because you don't do it, but you want to eat that food through the whole year, most things only come into production once a year. So we need to preserve them somehow. Commercially, this is often done in metal cans. You can go buy canned corn or canned mushrooms, or whatever the case may be, or they're frozen. You can buy frozen food, or they're made into pre-made TV dinners or something where there's all kinds of preservatives and stuff added, and they're variously preserved through vacuum sealing and freezing and so on. But the four main methods of preserving food that can be done when you are doing things yourself at home that I am aware of are canning, dehydrating, fermenting, and freezing. Now I'm not going to cover those other three in any kind of depth. I just want to point out that there are other ways to do things. Fermenting is like my jar of sauerkraut that I've got going here right now. It's fermenting away with its little vent lid on top. You can see the bubbles in there. It's going to be ready to eat here in a couple more days. Once it's done actually fermenting at room temperature here on the counter, it's going to go in a cool place like the fridge. Fermenting is probably one of the best ways to preserve things, because what you're doing here is you're actually enhancing the nutrition of the cabbage in this instance. You can ferment many things, pretty much anything, any kind of fruit or veggie anyway, and you're working with good bacteria and microbial life to enhance all that and eat it. This is a very live food. So once it's done fermenting here on the countertop, it's going to go somewhere cool so it doesn't break down further, but it'll be good for 6 months or more in a cool place. Now my cool place is my fridge over here. and it is somewhat small. So if I have a whole lot of things, I can't keep them all there. That is my only cool place. The house is warm and outside can be way below zero. So I don't have any other cool place at the moment. If I had a large root cellar, I would probably ferment more things than I already do because I'd have a nice cool place where I could keep them longer. I don't at the moment, so I always ferment some things. I try to eat something fermented pretty much at least once a day. You don't need a ton, you don't need a whole plateful or bowlful, but at least a couple spoonfuls of something with all of that living bacteria and such in it. So I highly encourage fermenting. I've done a few videos on things like making sauerkraut. I plan to continue doing more, but there's lots of other people out there who do videos on all kinds of great ways to ferment food. So that would be my first preference, but as I said, with a large volume, I can't ferment 40 quarts of carrots and keep them all in my fridge, for 6 months. I just don't have the fridge space for that. So I also can things. The other main methods are foods being dry. Dry, like these are lentils, wheat, rice, etc. Those are all things that are dry and will be shelf stable for, meaning they're still good to eat for, depending on the grain or bean, somewhere between 10 to 40, 50 years. That they will be fine a very long time as long as they stay dry and don't get any moisture in there or any kind of bugs inside. Or you can dry lots of things, like these are dried tomatoes. These are actually from my parents who had an excess on their crop and dried some and sent them to me, which was lovely since they know I can't grow them. So they just cut them in slices and air dried them. I also air dry a lot of things. I don't really need a dehydrator here because my climate is so dry, but you guys have seen me dry various herbs and teas and flowers. If I had tomatoes of my own, I would dry them. I will, if I ever get a good deal on some kind of fruit like apples or pineapples, I've dehydrated all kinds of those things. I often take them while I'm backpacking or hiking because they're very lightweight food to carry, but they're also just great as a snack. Dehydrating preserves a lot of nutrients. It is not complicated to do. I hope to do more videos on how to do that, but that is another method of preserving things. And then freezing. I did do one video on blanching and freezing peas this year. Freezing I don't do a lot of right at the moment, mostly because I am somewhat limited on my freezer space. Freezing can also be an excellent method for preserving foods because it done properly, and some foods do need blanch to basically keep the enzymes from continuing to mature and break down the food, like a pea or a bean, so that when it comes out of the freezer and you want to eat it, it's not tough and woody and flavorless. But it preserves a whole lot of nutrients and flavors. Like sauerkraut, if I had more than I could refrigerate, you could freeze it, and that would basically put all those beneficial microbes on hold without destroying them, whereas if I can them, I'm heating it up and I'm going to actually destroy them. So freezing can be a great method for preserving things. Unlike dehydrating or drying out foods, which requires nothing other than to keep them dry. They can sit on a shelf anywhere. That doesn't require any energy. Or fermenting, which doesn't really require energy other than having a cool spot, and my current only cool spot is a refrigerator. It's certainly possible to have other cool spots depending on your house and your setup and where you live. Those don't necessarily require any external inputs to keep the food preserved once you have dried it or fermented it. Freezing, however, does. You probably need to keep the freezer running, and that's usually done through electricity, sometimes through propane, something like that. So that is something to consider, because if you, for instance, are in California right now and are in the path of some of those high winds and have your power company turning power off to you, if you had a year's worth of food in a freezer and had no backup way to keep that freezer cold, you could lose all of that. So that is something to consider. Freezing is one of the best ways to preserve nutrients, but it also is one of the more energy intensive ways to keep them preserved. So back to the fourth topic here now, the one I'm actually wanting to cover today, canning. I do all of those other things, but I do also a lot of canning. This seals food, preserves it. Basically, this is my Ariel's opinion indefinitely. I have eaten canned food that was more than a decade old with no problem. If you want to know the specific limits for each kind of food, I think you can look it all up on USDA.gov, and it'll tell you this should last a year, this should be good for 18 months, so on. But I think it's pretty safe to say anything is going to last more than a year, and I usually eat everything up well before that. But this does create somewhat a dead food. These things have all been heated and cooked, And so there is some nutrient and mineral and vitamin loss. It is still better on almost everything than buying, if I can grow or produce the things myself, or in the case of like the service berries, they were picked wild around my house. They were so much more nutrient dense to start with than anything I can find in a grocery store, and or so inexpensive or free to either grow or just go forage like wild berries, that nutrient loss is worth it to me. I'll just eat a few more carrots and so on and be able to eat my own versus buying fresh. And if you live in an area where you can grow things more year round, or there's great farmers markets, continually sourcing fresh may be a great option. But if you live in any of the parts of the world that have winter, local fresh stuff tends to not exist in the winter. Again, with some exceptions, like you can grow sprouts and a lot of microgreens and stuff pretty easily through the winter. But that is why I'm preserving this stuff. Now, on to canning questions. I got a question. I'm going to see if I can not forget anything here. Is there anything you can't can? Not really, as far as that it would not be possible, because all you're doing in the process of canning is taking a jar, putting something in it, and giving it an airtight seal, which for the most part prevents anything changing or happening at that point. You can put anything in a can now, or in a jar, and can it. As far as would you want to do everything, there are some things I do not enjoy canned. Canned peas, I think, taste bland and flavorless. I don't enjoy them at all. I would rather either eat them fresh, put them in the freezer, or do without peas, because I just don't enjoy canned peas. But you may certainly can peas. It's very possible. They will be safe to eat. I just don't enjoy them. So there's things like that that you may find you do not enjoy the flavor canned, but it's still very possible to do, as far as any fruit and veggie that I am aware of. So, anything I can't can. Somebody did ask me about weight in a tiny house. Does having a bunch of canned food add weight? It does. And having a whole bunch of glass jars in a house that's on wheels, if I was going down the road every day, that would actually be a serious consideration, because that would be somewhat hard to keep things from shifting and rattling and breaking. Since my house, even though it is on wheels, is parked in a location where I'm not moving regularly, that is not really a big issue for me. I would need to take everything off the shelves and pack it in like a box if I was going to actually move. So that is something to consider if you're on the road actually all the time. Now, of kinds of canning, there are three main kinds. The one you've seen me do in every video you've seen so far here is a steam bath canner, and that is what this is, sitting right back here. It opens up like this. There's a grate in the bottom there. That part fills with water. The jars sit on top of the grate. The lid goes on. The whole top fills with steam till it's coming out the little holes in the bottom, and that steam is the same temperature as boiling water would be, and that is what is heating our jars to create a vacuum and seal them. A water bath canner is basically the same thing, except it's almost inverted. It's usually a big pot clear full of boiling water instead of steam. You submerge your jars into the water, put a lid on. Water bath canning and steam bath canning, as far as what you can do with each one, are basically interchangeable. If you can water bath can it, you can steam bath can it. Some people prefer one or the other. I really like steam bath. I grew up doing steam bath. My mom has since transferred back to, she likes water bath canning, partially because they've got a massive water bath canner that'll hold like 17 quarts at a time, which is nice when they're doing big volumes of stuff. I don't know of any steam bath canners that hold that many, but probably most of you aren't trying to do multiple batches of 17 quarts at a time. But anyway, water bath and steam bath canning can be used pretty much interchangeably. The third method of canning, and again we're talking about home canning here, not commercial stuff, is pressure canning. I don't have a pressure canner here at the moment. I actually sold mine when I moved into a tiny house here because I thought I wouldn't have an opportunity to do it. Now that's one of the only things I actually regret having gotten rid of when I kind of downsized my life, because there are some things I would like to pressure can. At some point I will get one again. I don't have enough time and space to really make good use of one at the moment. But pressure canning is different in that steam and water bath canning are using the heat of boiling water, which at sea level is 212 degrees, either the water or the steam created by it. Or at my elevation, I'm a little over 6,000 feet, that temperature is only 197. Water boils at 197, not 212 here, and that would change as you went further up in elevation. Pressure canning is sealing it in to allow you to heat it heat the water to some number of degrees, depending on the pressure you reach, higher than boiling water can achieve in the open air. That is best used for things that would tend to potentially spoil if only heated to, let's just say 212, because that's the standard sea level number. So there are things that can be steam or water bath canned, and then there are things that should be pressure canned to be safe. Those things are generally anything that is not high acid. You'll notice that in my list of things here, there's quite a few pickled things. The Danish Christmas cabbage is pickled. It has salt and vinegar, as do dill pickles, as do my pickled carrots, as do my pickled beets, as do my sweet pickles. And the other things are fruits. Tomatoes are a fruit, berries, peaches, and applesauce. Anything with enough acid and vinegar, and just for the sake of trying to keep this somewhat concise, you guys could go look up the acceptable acid and vinegars levels to make that stuff safe, or any fruit should be safe for water bath canning. Other things which you're not seeing here at the moment, like meats, which you can certainly can, or meat broth, or soups or leftover dishes like that have meat in them, or meat broth or something like that, they should be pressure canned, because without the acid that's naturally present either in fruits or in things that are pickled, they have a little bit more potential for nasty bacteria to grow in them. And that brings me to my next topic, which is safety when canning. Some people are very nervous to do it because they think it's very unsafe and could kill you. Now, I want to say right up front, improperly handled food can and does kill people. It does this every day, unfortunately. Most of it these days, at least in the States, is coming from improperly handled or contaminated, commercially processed food. So, taking good care of your food, whether you're doing it yourself or some giant company is doing it, is very important, or food poisoning of various kinds can kill you. That is true. I trust myself to have more motivation to take good care of my food than a random process in a big company. So whether there are risks on both sides, and everyone, like everything else, has got to weigh the risks and benefits and decide what you're comfortable with, I am very comfortable with the risks associated with home canning, which are quite small. I have been doing this virtually my whole life. I started helping with canning when I was a tiny little child. I grew up around hundreds of people who had been canning for their whole lives, including my, great-grandparents, so that's more than 100 years of history. Most of my great-grandparents were in their upper 90s when they died, and I never knew of a single person who actually got sick from home canned goods. I do know it is possible, it happens, it's very rare, and now I'm going to tell you how you can make sure that doesn't happen to you. Let me see here, what am I missing on my list? So, safety. First big thing, how do you tell if a jar is sealed? All these are canned and sitting on my shelf, they are all sealed. When I press on the middle of this lid, if I don't hit my lampshade, you hear how there's no sound. Versus on this jar, which is just dried dill seed, you guys hear that? That is an unsealed lid. This doesn't need to be sealed. It's perfectly dry. The jar is just being my container instead of a bag or a box or whatever else. That's what an unsealed lid sounds like. If these were not sealed, you would be able to hear that same pop. It's the same kind of lid. If you get it really level with the light, you can actually see a little bubble that looks up versus down, but that can be really hard to see. That sound is the real giveaway. So if that is sucked down, it's pressurized inside there, and there is there's a tight seal. Somebody asked me about Tadler lids. They're a reusable one. I've heard good things about them. I've never personally used them, so I can't actually speak to that, but they work in a very similar way. So the first thing you want to do is make sure your jar is sealed. If I went and opened my pantry and pretend I pulled out my jar of applesauce here, and I was going to have some applesauce, I take the ring off, and I go to open the lid, which I can do with that, but let's just pretend I'm going to use a can opener. Now listen for this sound. Did you hear that little suck? You could see the lid pop up. Now it goes up and down, and I can even see air suck into there. So I know when I opened that applesauce, it was sealed. The next thing you would do, and if I went and pulled a jar out of there and went to open that and there was no suck, I couldn't hear it unseal, this would be going straight into my compost pile. I just wouldn't risk it. I wouldn't eat it if that jar was not sealed when I went to open it. Next thing, you can visually look at it. It looks like applesauce. There's nothing, it smells like apples, it smells delicious, and a little bit of cinnamon. There's nothing that smells nasty or bad. There's nothing that looks nasty or bad, like mold growing and so on. So visually and scent-wise, whatever that word would be, I can tell that this applesauce is just fine, and I can eat it. And it tastes delicious. This is homemade with wild apples, actually. If you open a jar and there's no seal, I would throw it. If you open a jar and you're pretty sure it was sealed, but you see or smell anything weird in there, throw it away. It's just not worth the risk. I'm trying to think, in more than 20 years of opening canned goods and using them for cooking, I think I've found an unsealed jar on the shelf once, and I don't even remember what food it was, maybe canned peaches or something. But that is very, very rare. That's in thousands and thousands of jars. I've only found an unsealed one once. Now this is unsealed, so since I'm not going to eat the whole quart of applesauce while I'm talking to you guys, it is going to go in the fridge, because now it is not shelf stable. I can't just put it back in there at room temperature, because I've gotten new air and new potential bacteria and such in there. So now I'm going to keep it cold till I finish eating it. So that's the main safety things to look for. Is it actually sealed? And is there anything visibly or that you can smell wrong with it? The one thing that concerns a lot of people, because none of those things will tell you if it's there, is botulism. It's a bacteria that is everywhere. It's probably on my skin right now, on the floor, in the garden, in my cupboards, on you. It's everywhere on the planet Earth. So it's not normally a problem. What botulism can do is produce a toxin that, if it is in a oxygen-deprived environment, which is what's going on inside these jars because we've sealed them, there's no new oxygen coming and going, it can produce a toxin that can be deadly. Botulism, you can get botulism actually in a wound. There are several infections every year from that. There are a few from home canned good. This is per the CDC website. A high percentage are from wounds, a few are from home canned goods, a few are from commercially canned goods. And the scary part of botulism is that you can't smell it or see it or taste it. It doesn't grow mold. It doesn't smell nasty. So it's a little bit scary because it's invisible. It's the same toxin actually used in Botox. Botulism, it's part of the botulism toxin that is in Botox that gives you basically nerve damage. That's what you're doing if you put Botox in your cheek to get rid of a wrinkle or something. You're nerve damaging just an isolated spot, so you're paralyzing it, so it's not saggy or wrinkly anymore. But that's just maybe an interesting note, that if you've gotten Botox, you've intentionally had yourself injected with the botulism toxin. But if you eat a big amount of it, it can kill you. The way to prevent that is botulism, though it likes low oxygen environments to produce that toxin, it does not like acid or salt. So all of these things, like we talked about, the fruits have their own acidity to them, and all of the pickled things, even though carrots or cucumbers do not naturally find themselves being high in acid, they have both a lot of acid and salt added to them. If you were going to just can plain cucumbers with no vinegar or salt, you would need to pressure can, as we're going to talk about in a minute. But cucumbers saturated in lots of vinegar and salt, and again, feel free to look up the details and exact proportions that are considered safe for all this. That is, again, an environment where botulism cannot grow. One of the other scary things about botulism is it is not killed at the boiling point of water, at 212 or whatever the boiling point is where you are. A lot of other toxins are. So realistically, even though I wouldn't recommend this, if you open up a jar of spaghetti sauce here and your seals wasn't good, which again, I wouldn't use it, but if you were gonna put this in a pot and simmer it for a while with some pasta or something, you would probably still be okay, because you would have killed, cooked to death right before eating it, almost anything that was in there. I'm not recommending you do that with food you think is spoiled, but I'm just saying, if it's something you're also going to be heating, that's yet another layer of safety. But botulism is not killed by heating to normal boiling temperatures, hence the reason for a pressure canner, which allows us to heat things higher than the boiling point of water. So for any low acid things, like I said, if you wanted to can just plain carrots with no vinegar and salt, if you wanted to can meat, and I don't have any examples here because I haven't done it recently, but I have in my life canned beef, chicken, and turkey, and fish. You can can pork. I've never liked pork, don't usually eat pork, but that's possible to can as well. Any of those things, or people have asked, can you can leftover soup? You know, you made a pot of chili and you want to save some of it for later. Yes, you can. All of that stuff should go in a pressure canner. These lists are easy to find if you look up the USDA or any other website on what is safe to pressure can versus water steam bath can. You'll find that basically the water and steam bath list is fruits, veggies with lots of acid either naturally in them or added to them, and that's about it. Everything else goes on the pressure can list. So hopefully that makes sense. Things that can go wrong. I was asked a lot about that. So I've kind of covered that already with if a jar is unsealed, and that could happen. Usually if I've had a jar not sealed, it's like the day I can it. Yeah, I try to let my jars sit for 24 hours. There may be one that didn't seal for whatever reason in that process. At that point, it's still good. I just canned it a day ago. Just put it in the fridge, use it in the next little bit. But if I pull one out of the, pantry and it's been sitting there for some length of time and it's not sealed, to me, I'm going to throw that away. Very, very rare. Hardly ever happens. Something else with the lids, so with a brand new lid, and here different sizes of jars, that's why I actually had this out here. There are three main sizes. These are quarts, that's 4 cups. These are pints, that's 2 cups. And this is usually sold as a jelly or jam jar. This is a 1 cup jar. These all come in either narrow or, the narrow ones are called regular mouth. These are called wide mouth. I just think of them as narrow and wide mouth. All the jars come in both. I prefer wide mouth. I have mostly wide mouth quarts. This is a narrow mouth quart. The pint jars come in narrow and wide mouth as well, and there are even wide mouth jelly jars. They're shorter and squattier. That's just a preference. I find the wide mouths are just easier to get things in and out of, so if I'm going to buy a jar, I prefer that. But as far as safety and food preservation, there's no difference on the mouth size. So as you've seen in the canning videos, we're going to can something. I've taken my empty jar, got it filled up. I get a brand new lid here. This is one that I know people will reuse lids, and I know people have been doing it for a long time and haven't died. That's one I'm personally not comfortable with and do not recommend, as do not most other people. This is a brand new lid. You can see it's rubber ring. This is the other side. It's got a coating on there, the white stuff to keep the metal from coming in any contact with the food. And you can see the orange part is a rubber that's going to seal. This is one that was used. You can see how there's a dent into that rubber, if the light catches it right, where it was smashed up against the jar rim. That's why I wouldn't reuse it, because you've already taken a lot of the elasticity out of that rubber. And sure, it might seal a second time, maybe even a third. It's not going to be as likely to be as tight of a seal, and that's why I just don't reuse it. Now, I will reuse a lid like that to put on something that's not sealed anyway, like my dried herbs. It's just a lid to keep dust out. But if you're using it for actually canning something, resealing something, I would not reuse it. I would also not reuse it. I kept this one specifically because of this. If you didn't notice it in that first close-up, see that dent right in the rim of the lid? Anything that was dented right there, or actually anywhere in the lid, I would not use. Even if it was brand new, which this one's not, but even if it was brand new, if I got a dent into the rim there, that could cause a problem with sealing, so I would not use that. This one's going in the trash. I actually just had kept it specifically to show you guys for this video. And again, like I've talked about, when I can anything, my last step before putting the lid on is I, get my fingers wet with some very hot water and wipe off the rim to be sure no little bit of apple or peach or whatever has gotten stuck in there and prevent the seal from forming tightly. And even if you miss that, it should not be sealed down snugly. You should hear that. If you miss that, when you open the lid, you aren't going to hear any suction. So there's multiple, kind of fail-safes there to know if you've failed to get a actual seal. Siphoning. Somebody asked me about that. Siphoning would be, I don't have an example here of it because I don't have one that did it, but if you look at this jar, you can see the liquid's basically right up to the neck. That's where we want it to be. If it was siphoned, this is not siphoned, but see how I tip it down? If all of my water was gone partway down, and I just have my cucumber, my pickles up here, and there was only liquid from here down, that would be caused by the liquid having siphoned out. I've not really had a problem with that. I think it can happen most often if you have a shock to your jars. Like if this was really cold and I put it in boiling water bath, that alone can kind of suck all the moisture, all the water out because you haven't got a seal there yet. It's in the process of sealing. You don't want that. If you have stuff that's siphoned out, it's not going to kill you or anything if you just take it right after canning and realize the jar's siphoned out, put it in the fridge, use it in the near future. I would not store that on the shelf, and as far as I know, the best way to prevent that is making sure things are hot. So when I can spaghetti sauce, my sauce is boiling, my jars were hot and clean, my canner was hot, put it all in there hot, it's sealed. I have never really had a problem with siphoning, but it's something that can happen. Jars cracking. That is very similar. Let's see, once between this year and last, I had a jar crack. It was a jar of peaches. I don't know what happened. Usually, there can be a flaw in individual jars. Sometimes you buy brand new jars and you can see a bubble or something in the glass that's weaker. Brand new jars are often thinner glass than very old canning jars. They were just made out of a thicker glass. So there can be a weakness in the glass that could cause it. Most of the time, it is caused, again, by shocking the glass with too great of a change from cold to very hot. Or sometimes the other way, when you take them out, everything's scalding hot because it's done being canned. If you set it on a cold countertop, that shock could fracture the glass as well. So keeping everything at a steady temperature is the main way to prevent that. Every now and then it still happens. Like I said, I had one jar of peaches crack. It's a fact of working with things like glass. Sometimes something will break. But if you have something going wrong if it's frequent. I'd say I have one jar out of every 300 or 400 might do that. That was one of the reasons my mom actually said she prefers water bath. She thinks she breaks less jars than steam bath. I don't really have any jars break with steam bath, so that's kind of a personal preference thing. On the note of jars and old versus new and such, rings you can reuse basically forever, whatever the size is. Eventually, if there's something really acidic in there or salty, they can get rusty and nasty and they're just a pain. But once something is canned and sealed, you do not need this ring on here anymore. It can just come off, be washed, and go back in my ring bin for use next time, because all the ring was doing was holding that lid on there till the jar created a seal. Now that lid, and again I want to be gentle because I don't want to shock anything, but that lid is not going to come off until I pop the seal and you hear that suction. The ring has done its job. With things like cucumbers where there is, or pickles where there is a lot of both acid and salt in there, and some could certainly have gotten into the ring while I was canning it, before it was sealed. If I keep these on there for the next year or, 6 months or whatever till I eat this, it is going to start making my ring kind of corroded and nasty. So I prefer, and I had some done here and some not, 24 hours after canning to actually pull the rings off, wash them, and put them back in my ring bin, just to keep that from happening because they're not doing anything useful on the jar at that point. So the rings you can reuse virtually indefinitely. The jars you can reuse virtually indefinitely unless you break one. If you want to get into canning and you don't have jars, I highly recommend checking out if you're in any place where the more canning is done than my area. There are lots and lots of jars usually at thrift stores, garage sales, sometimes sitting at the end of people's lanes with a free sign on it, because a lot more people used to do this, and as a lot of those people have died off, and a lot more of my generation does not do this, and people clean out their houses or their parents' houses or whatever. There's a lot of jars being given away. If a jar looks visually intact, there's no cracks, there's nothing, the main thing to check for, there should not be a chip right here. Again, that would affect the actual sealing. So if you can see a chip or if you can feel any irregularities, I would not use that jar. But other than that, it doesn't matter if that jar is 150 years old. it will be perfectly fine for canning. So that may be a way, if you want to save some money, you can possibly get old jars or even rings from somebody who's no longer using them. The part that I do not buy used or reuse, as I discussed, is the actual lids themselves, and I already went over the reasons why. So that may be a way you can save some money if you are wanting to get started with this and you don't currently have any jars. The canners themselves, as far as I know, this one that I have, this steam bath canner, recently was no longer manufactured. There's a very similar one now that is made by the same company that makes that tomato strainer I like to use. I haven't personally used it, so I can't give you pros and cons one way or the other, but it looks like it's set up exactly like this, and other equipment made by them that I've used for many, many decades without a problem. So if I was buying one today, I would go with that, even though this is an older one and it is no longer available. And people say, well, can I can things if I don't have a canner? Yes, but you can. There are ways to just heat jars in a big kettle. My grandmother and some other people would even just heat up their stuff, put it in there, flip the jars upside down. Those are all things that are possible. There are things people have done. They're not as safe. They're not as secure of a seal. I don't recommend them. So that's why the yes, but. They're possible. People have done it. They are not all dead. But it's not as safe, and I don't recommend you go that route. If you really want to do this, I do recommend that you take some time if you need to, save up the money and get an actual canner, either a steam or a water bath. And then if you're going to do things like meat or any of those things that should not be done in a steam or water bath, that you actually get a pressure canner. Overall cost, not just of the supplies, but say I have all these supplies, which I do at this point. I've got, you don't have to have this, but having a funnel that goes nicely into your jar is nice. Again, all the stuff I've used you can find on Amazon.com/shop/find Nyth. But I basically have everything at this point. My only ongoing expense going forward is buying new lids every year, since I don't want to reuse them. But the actual cost of, what does it cost to make a jar of carrots? For me, and probably for anybody, if you can grow it yourself, like I grew the carrots, I grew the beets, etc., I wild harvested the berries, if you can do that, then of course your time is worth something, but I enjoy gardening anyway. It's things I like to do. I enjoy going foraging for things like berries. Those are things I like to do. So not counting my time, which you do have to take into consideration if you have limited time, but as far as financial expense, there was almost no expense to acquiring those foods. So when I have plenty of them, preserving them just makes financial sense. I don't have to go buy berry juice. I don't have to go buy pickled carrots, etc. If you have to buy the thing, that is more of a trade-off to consider. Like for me, tomatoes and peaches, I have to buy. I do not live where tomatoes or peaches grow. I talked about this a bit when making spaghetti sauce. For me, it is worth it. Even though if I price out every ingredient, including, having to buy the tomatoes and the herbs and such that I put in there, and the onions and garlic, it breaks about even with buying a jar of spaghetti sauce in a grocery store. I love the flavor of this so much more, and I've never had any purchased spaghetti sauce that I was happy with. So it's worth it to me to do it, even though the expense is even, because of the flavor and the enjoyment, and that I know what's in there and there's no other preservatives or anything else. On some things you buy, it's still cheaper. I did the math on what buying, a can of canned peaches at a grocery store costs versus me buying the peaches and canning my own. And again, you have the different benefits of I know what went into that jar because everything that's in there I put in there. But it still costs me about 50% less per cup of peaches to buy peaches and can my own versus buying a can at the grocery store. Now that math is going to vary for you depending what you can source at what price in your area and so on, but that is something to think about. For me, the only time I'd really question is if it actually costs me more to produce it than I could buy it already canned from a grocery store. And even then, depending what the thing is, I may choose to do it for the flavor, the nutritional quality, and what's actually in it. But if it breaks even or costs less, to me that's a no-brainer. I'm for sure going to do it. Somebody asked, just to cover this, asked about canning dog food. I do want to do a video on Burley's food. I don't can dog food. That would be possible. You could do your own. He eats an all raw diet. Canned food is cooked, so I don't can his food. And the last question somebody asked me was about canning milk. There are people who can dairy products like butter and such. I have never personally done it. I think the official recommendation is that it is never safe. It goes back into that category of, is it possible to put it in a jar and seal it? Yes, it certainly is. You can put whatever you wanted in there and seal it. Is it safe and recommended? The answer seems to be no. I've never done it. If it's something you really want to do, look into that further and make your own decisions about your risks and benefits. I guess the only other thing I didn't mention is this is a handy little jar lifter. It makes it really easy to pick up a jar when they're scalding hot. And so I think that is very nice to have. Could you do without it? If you were just getting started and didn't have it, sure. You'd want to use a good hot pad or something. The advantage of this is if you pick this up with a hot pad, you're kind of pulling right on the seal edge there, which I don't want to do. This lets you actually grab the jar itself and nothing is touching this seal edge. So that is the advantage of that, but could you live without one of these? Sure. Could you live without a funnel that fits mason jars? Sure. But I use this all the time for all kinds of things, even when I'm not canning, because I store so many things in glass jars. So I think that's everything I can think of and all the questions people asked me directly related to canning. If I forgot one, I'm sorry this got long, but there were so many different questions from different people and I wanted to try to cover it as concisely as I could in a single video. If I forgot something that you want to know, ask down below. And if you've always thought canning was really scary and terrifying, I just want to tell you it's not. Even very small children can do it. I have seen that my entire life. With, you know, when they're very, very small, some supervision around very hot things and oversight of what they're doing. There are safety concerns that are possible. It is not that hard to tell whether or not something is actually sealed. If you're using half a brain, there should be no issue with food spoilage. And again, I've never personally known anyone who has gotten sick from home canned foods, though improperly handled foods, I just want to say it again, can kill you whether you handle them yourself or someone else handles them. But anyway, hopefully that answers questions and maybe encourages you guys to try canning some things. If you have anything you can grow yourself or access in an abundance at a reasonable price, just experiment. And you certainly don't have to start with canning dozens or hundreds or thousands of quarts. Start with 4 or 5 or 6. Oh, and speaking of that, the one other thing I should mention, I know I've talked about this in some other videos, it is generally best to can all the same sizes together. So if you're doing a canner of quart jars, do all quart jars. Don't do full quarts with pint jars. The processing times are usually different for the different sizes. And for processing times, look up, again, I can't possibly list each one, but there's usually a recommended amount of time to process a berry versus a tomato versus a peach versus a cabbage, you know, pickled cabbage versus a carrot, and so on. And those can range from 5 minutes to 45 minutes or so, usually somewhere in there. But just whatever thing you want to can, I mean, get on Google Pants and ask, you know, canning time for sweet pickles or whatever you're trying to do and look it up. So hopefully that encourages you guys to try canning and preserving some of the delicious bounty that hopefully you're growing in your garden, or maybe that you can get from a neighbor or a local farmer's market who's growing it in their garden. Happy and safe enjoyment of delicious food in the kitchen to all of you. Hi folks, Ariel over here. Thanks for spending some of your valuable time watching these videos. Hopefully you found something beautiful, educational, interesting, peaceful, relaxing, or useful while you are here. If so, find more videos here, subscribe so you don't miss any updates, and if you like what you found here, feel free to like and share away so that others can benefit as well. You all have a wonderful day.